And welcome again to the Gene and Ken Show. Today we're going to concentrate on Port Sheldon, where it turns at Sunnybrook and heads west. And there are quite a few interesting things that happened in this southern part of Georgetown Township. Gene, what can you remember?
Okay, remember we covered it in our earlier one about up into the Andres Crossing, which would have been right in there. Right in there. Now where this little road went, I don't know, I don't ever remember, but there was where the DeWinter's nursery is right there underneath that, where it says 10, on the north side of the road. On the south side would have been the old, where Curly DeWinter, which would have been a son of the original DeWinters, lived. The next dot you see on the north side there was where Lucius, or Lumen, one of those, Lucius lived there. That was part of the Jenison farm, later on became part of the Andre farm.
And here at the end of 8th Avenue
Was the cemetery.
Jenison Family Cemetery.
Jenison Family Cemetery. There's the old Jenison, the big old Jenison house, which still stands today, with the big old cupola on the top.
And their barn was on the opposite side of the road.
Yep.
And this school symbol.
That's Bursley School. Now there's a little story behind Bursley. You notice just to the left of that is Beardsley property. Originally the name of the school was Beardsley, and then through some penmanship error or something, somebody didn't read it right and it became Bursley. But anyway, originally it was Beardsley.
And normally the school gets the name of the landowner, and you can see here it was owned by the Jenisons, but the Jenisons had already given their name to number 6 school downtown, and so it was decided that Beardsley, or Bursley as it turned out, was the one to get the name. And we're also going to be jumping farther south a little later, so we move on here. And here's an aerial photograph from probably the 60s.
About the mid-60s, 64, 65, somewhere in that area.
You can see the Chicago Drive coming through, and this lake appeared. How did it get?
That was the dirt. That was part of the Blissfeld farm, 1963, for dirt for the 196 extension from Chicago Drive to 28th Street in Granville.
That's where this road came in, that they hauled the dirt out.
That's where the dirt was hauled out.
And
this is the beginning of Rushmore Lake, which was on the Jenison's property. And that started in, about the same time. And then they also added another one to the east of this. That was part of the Blissfeld farm and part of, it became the Andre farm later on. Right in that neck of the woods there was another one.
so today this is all subdivision,
That's part of Rushmore Lake.
part of Rushmore Lake. And then Port Sheldon, you can see, comes south, and here you can also see the property line scars of the right-of-way for the interurban.
Yes.
Right on through Sunnybrook. And this is the famous Sunnybrook curve. And this picture shows the Hiram Jenison house here. It looks like the barn was gone by then.
No, you're too far to the east, Ken. Because you gotta go to the west is the cemetery, and it was to the,
Oh,
yeah, right in there.
right in here.
Right in there, yes.
There are a number of small structures there now.
Right. There's some houses that were built before the farm was discontinued. There were some houses that some of the Jenison younger generation family lived in those houses.
Okay. Now the Jenison family itself, this is like a little family tree, and Hiram being the oldest brother, but Lemuel and Sarah were dad and mom that came from New York and put down roots right here in Georgetown Township. And Harriet and Althea were sisters, and Annie, and then came Lucius and Lumen. but the L Jenison Company came from the boys, Hiram, Lucius, and Lumen. But you can see here, Lucius and Lumen never married, so they did not have direct descendants. However, Hiram married Beardsley, and they had a number of direct descendants. And from Althea comes the Nelson Bliss marriage, and Blissville Farms started around the corner on Port Sheldon. And then Betsy, the very youngest of the Jenison family, she was only 3 years old. And Betsy married Ben Hanchett Sr., a riverboat captain, and they had Ben Hanchett as a son who married Bessie, and so that's a few of the Jenison family. Hiram, and then Mary Beardsley married, and this is a photograph of Betsy with her son,
Her grandson,
Gerald. Well, Hiram built this large house, which still stands. We're not quite sure of the timing of it, but somewhere in the 50s or 60s. That's 1860 or 1850. This appeared in the plat map book of 1876. Here's another photograph. You can see the barn across the street, and this of course would be Port Sheldon. And there's Lucius's house. What else do you see here, Gene?
Well, at the end of 8th Avenue where the trees are there is where the cemetery is. It's descendants of the Jenison family are buried there. The old house there, the roads along the side doesn't appear to be paved yet, so I would think that this was in the mid-50s when they started developing it on the south side of Port Sheldon. As you can see, the north side was still undeveloped as far as any roads in through there. There's a couple of houses there that belong to the younger generation of the Jenisons.
So the Jenisons have to cross the road to milk the cows and keep the farm going.
Yeah, when I was younger, none of the Jenisons lived in the big old house. The Harold and Mary lived just to the west of the barn. The mother and father that I knew, and a couple of the kids, the younger kids, one of the daughters lived right by the cemetery, and Harold, or Hud, the oldest boy, lived about halfway between the cemetery and the barn. And I don't know when the other boys got married, but some of the boys, there's a couple of boys worked for the telephone company, etc. They would run the farm, at night till their kids got old enough to do a little farm work during the day.
Here's an early photograph. It looks like Doug Jenison, one of the sons of Hiram, sitting there. And looks like 4 kids and a wife. And the outside of the house really hasn't changed that much. Here's a picture of Doug. And here's a more modern picture. It's been used in private hands for quite a few years. Some cut it into apartments, and there was a try for a bed and breakfast at one time. And now it's just a private home. The cupola on top still is there, and you can see the foundation stones still intact. We did get one photograph inside. This was during an estate sale, and so things aren't exactly arranged, but you can see that they've maintain some of the historic feel for the house inside and outside. Gene, you thought this was Port Sheldon?
That's Port Sheldon, that would be looking, this picture is taken looking towards the northwest.
From the north, yes. Now, this is an early photograph of Lucius, and yeah, he's all dressed up. Here he is as an older man on his back porch, but this is the house that burned, and he caught pneumonia while fighting the fire, and ended up being brought into town, and later died. And then another house was built on the foundation of the old house. And Gene, you remember this house?
Well, yeah, I remember that house. This picture was taken roughly right at the corner of Port Sheldon and 8th Avenue, looking toward to the northeast. This was, when I can remember this one was bought by the Andrews, and I don't know just.
And Lumen lived in town in the brick block, and he was being groomed as the business person of the family after Hiram died, and he even started a gate factory. So here they are as two stately gentlemen. They, after Hiram died, they actually bought marble and shipped it in to build a mausoleum in the Jenison Cemetery. And here you can see the open fields there in the to the east of the cemetery before the condos were built. And there's the edge of the mausoleum. There it is. Looks like construction's going on there.
It's probably in the late 60s there, they started working on building a lake back in there, and there would be piles of black dirt that they'd scraped up.
Today, school kids still are able to visit the mausoleum and make a nice field trip. After visiting here at the museum, they actually get inside because the Jenison family opens that each year so that they can see Lucius and Lumen lying in state there with the doors open, but normally they are closed and locked. Cemetery itself is full of Jenison families as well as some close friends. Got permission from the family, and the cemetery is still being maintained by the Jenison family. Beardsley, Liberty Tanner Beardsley, sitting out in front of his house, which we talked about from the map, was to the
west of the Beardsley School.
West and south, on the south side of Port Sheldon. And of course, famous Beardsley Tech.
Beardsley Tech, as we call it. I don't know why we ever called it Beardsley Tech, but some of the older kids started that, and us younger people just carried on the tradition.
So Beardsley has a one-room schoolhouse, and this was right on the corner. You can see a typical schoolhouse with the bell tower in the front and the smokestack in the back for the space heater that had to be maintained by the teacher, and student bodies sitting outside.
And some of these schools, in fact, when I went to Beardsley, it had a cloakroom out in front. You see a lot of these pictures of these schools. Some of them had the cloakroom in front, some of them didn't. But this one at that time didn't, but it did later on.
And then later, this section along Port Sheldon Road was replaced, the wooden structure, and then in the 50s, Beardsley School was expanded, but it was still its own school district and not joined the Georgetown Consolidated movement until the 60s. Now we're going to move from, make this a little bigger, from the Port Sheldon area south all the way to the township line to an area right around here that was known as Shack Huddle. Shack Huddle was just kind of a gathering of farm buildings, but in the earliest days during lumbering, it was a base for the lumbermen. It's said that they kind of built some shacks up there in the hills so that they would be closer to their work, and the area became known as Shack Huddle. There is a school there yet today, Shack Huddle School, and you can see the name up on the plate on the building yet. And this replaced a wooden structure. It's part of the Hudsonville district. There is a place where there are a couple of gravestones there. It's known as the Shack Huddle Cemetery, but being on private property, it's not easy to find nor get to. The lumbering brought in the earliest settlers, and here you can see this was the
Bolt, this was the
Toten
which became,
family.
became the Bolt farm down, this was in the flatlands.
And yeah, you can see in the haze back there some of the other buildings and stacks of wood from their operation. And the Bolt sawmill, which was quite large, but all these men had to get out there. Some of them lived in the area, and some had to walk a little farther. But this was appears to be a steam-powered sawmill, and they're sitting around in all the logs that have been brought out from the forest. Another thing that happened was groups of people would show up to pick berries. You thought this was...
I think that this is what, in my time, in the 50s and 60s, was known as Corey's blueberries, which was on the corner of Van Buren and 14th. I'm not sure of that, but it's in the right spot for it to be. Because the blueberries couldn't go up on top of the hill because the soil wasn't good for it there.
So there was the McCoy farm out there. This is during harvest time, collecting all of the hay or straw.
This would be hay.
Okay,
By looking at the way it's on the wagon, you can tell that's hay.
hold it together, and then it would be stored hopefully in a barn. Another area just to the east and a little bit south of Shack Huddle area was Hanley, and this was the Hanley School.
Again, the typical bell tower in front, the chimney in back, and no cloakroom on this one either, but the building is similar to all the country schools were there at that time.
There is a Hanley Cemetery there yet today, and one interesting burial there is the brother of James Garfield, the President of the United States. His brother Thomas and James always liked to have a farm in what they called the wilderness. Well, they settled it before the turn of the century, bought the land and farmed it. Thomas was the one who farmed. James actually is said to have paid off the mortgage so that Thomas wouldn't have to work. There's a long story about how Thomas, the oldest brother, actually carried the family after his father's death back in, I believe it was Cleveland, Ohio, and James always made sure that he was taken care of, and this was one way to do it. There's even a book available at the Georgetown Library about Thomas Garfield. Jamestown Library. Another bright spot there on Jackson and 4th, it was the Hanley Chapel. Gene, what can you tell us about what happened there?
Well, this was a chapel started by First Christian Reformed Church of Jenison. They would assign families on Sunday night to go visit this church just to help, give them a little support, a little moral support, and help bring some more people into the church. But it was basically for moral support. They would assign people at the church to go there. And I can remember going here several times with my family.
And here it did expand and became the Hanley Christian Reformed Church. And today, this Christian Reformed Church continues, and it's located on the south side of Jackson Street, and they have a large modern church there. So Hanley Chapel grew into the Hanley CRC. Yeah, that may be the end of it.
That's the end of it.
Yeah. So that was a short and sweet section, the southeast section of Georgetown Township.
And there was before we leave this completely, there was an urban station up on top of the hill there at Shack Huddle, roughly where M6 and 196 come together. Right in that the general vicinity was a little station for the Hanley Shack Huddle area.
Now, I can remember a story of a murder happening on the McCoy farm, and it actually happened in a barn, which was close probably to this structure's mark, and the interurban went right past there, so as people went by or lingered at the interurban station, they would remember that murder.
One thing that we missed kind of on the way around, if you go up where the pointer says S. Decker up there, right there, was one of the first rest homes that I remember in the area. It's called the Irwin Home. And my uncle was there in the late 40s. I can remember visiting him, and he would come and visit us in the late 40s. And that was one of the first rest homes in the area.
So that property accessible here on, is this Kennewa? No,
No,
that wouldn't be Kennewa.
No, Kennewa's further over. That is, I think that's 4th Avenue
Could
there.
be 4th, yeah.
I think it's 4th
But
Avenue.
it looks like it dead-ended right here
Right.
at that property, giving access to it.
The Irwin Home was on 8th Avenue. That I do know.
Okay,
I can remember going there, so that would have been.
this would be 8th
Right,
Avenue.
right, yeah, maybe that little dot there right at the end, right here, could have been where the old Irwin Home was, because it was a big old farmhouse that was converted into like a nursing home.
Oh,
It was right across, where there was Waringas were in there, and a couple of the old families lived in there.
and these were the fields that you worked,
Yes.
and this would be the west branch of Rush Creek.
That's the main, well, they call it West Branch, we always are called to it Big Rush and Little Rush.
So this is Little Rush.
And it's the East Branch was always called the Little Rush, or some people even called it the Bliss Creek.
But regardless, everybody was rushing to get to Jenison.
Yep.
Okay. Well, good. Thank you very much, Gene, and we'll do this again.
We'll do it again, started it